Hey, did you know that Adam from the Bible lived to be almost 1,000 years old? He did? Yeah, and Eve and their kids and stuff lived for ages too. Yeah, if memory serves correctly, it was a kind of punishment for eating the forbidden apple in the Garden of Eden, God's divine law of witness or something, so people knew what went down. Hang on, he lives that long after eating an apple? Or some kind of fruit? Why? Well, it's probably nothing, but in Norse mythology, the gods gained their youth, vigor, and near immortality from the apples of Idun that she grew in her orchard. That's right. That's a funny coincidence. Eden's orchard, Garden of Eden. Yeah, I mean, it just would make a lot of sense as to why God didn't want humans eating them. Right. And come to think of it, there is this story in Norse mythology where Loki orchestrates the abduction of Eden, and all the gods grow old and weak because they don't have access to her apples anymore. Don't tell me you think the biblical god is actually Loki. No, of course not. That would mean that Loki offed all the other gods and rewrote history to pretend that he'd been the one and only god. Yeah, that would be dumb. The following is the new complete timeline for my theory that the biblical god is actually Loki. We start off with the apples of Idun, the source of the Norse gods' youth, vigor, and near immortality. There's one story where Loki orchestrates her abduction, and in that time, the Norse gods grow weak and enfeebled. Loki supposedly rectified this issue, but what if he only pretended to and let the other gods bite the big one, and then rewrote history to pretend he'd been the one and only god? In the Bible, we see the first humans, Adam and Eve, aka Ash and Elm, in the Garden of Eden, aka Eden's orchard. God doesn't want them eating the forbidden fruit, and when they do, they live to be like 1,000 years old. Off to a fantastic start, but there's one big flaw in Loki's plan. Ragnarok is still destined to happen and will be set in motion if he allows Baldur to perish, so he has no choice but to keep him captive, because after Ragnarok is prophesied that Baldur will return as a monotheistic god. Perhaps Loki will keep Baldur trapped underground, ironically suffering the punishment that he himself was supposed to endure after offing Baldur. Baldur is the god of light, and what name do we know that means Lightbringer? Lucifer. Loki is forced to keep Baldur captive, to discredit and slander him so that even if Ragnarok comes to pass, the Einherjar, or the army of God, will fight on Loki's side. And even if Baldur is successful in supplanting Loki as monotheistic god, people will hate him. Despite this, I think there is one other god that Loki would willingly keep around if only to torment. Odin. Odin was a notorious thorn in Loki's side, or vice versa, really. And I think Loki would concoct a unique punishment for the king of the gods, god of war and wisdom, something that would hit the notoriously proud god where it hurts most. His ego. Perhaps he would keep Odin captive for a time before brainwashing him, manipulating him, and poisoning his mind through magic and trickery. Think Theoden in Lord of the Rings. I think he would do this before putting Odin through a perversion of his own myth on the world stage, so that people know him not as the conqueror that he was, but as a servant of peace. That's right, history's most famous Nepo baby is actually Odin. His magic completely within Odin's wheelhouse, who is, after all, a god of magic too. In Odin's myth, he willingly hanged himself from the world tree in order to gain magic and power. In Jesus' myth, he was unwillingly hanged from a tree, or rather the wood from a tree in the form of a cross, for his lessers, his creations. Side note, when Jesus is tempted by Lucifer in the desert, we can now see that as just a son desperately trying to break Loki's spell and reawaken his father. It's also worth noting how Loki rebranded Freya, Odin's wife, goddess of fertility, as just a common prostitute. But the slander doesn't stop there, as what seems like payback for the time that Thor laid into Loki for cutting off Sif's characteristic golden hair, Loki appears to have conflated Sif and Thor within the biblical character of Samson, who possesses super strength until his hair is cut off. Seems like Loki making fun of the god of strength by pretending all of his power came from his hairdo. If you have any doubts, don't. This is Loki to a T. Remember how he ruined Aegir's feast for no reason by mocking all of the gods publicly. He even called Tyr a cuck in front of everyone. Anyway, circling back, or rather forward, to Ragnarok and Revelation, Heimdall's horn, Gjallarhorn, is said to herald Ragnarok when blown, and in the Bible, in Revelation, each apocalyptic event is preceded by the blowing of trumpets. Horsemen that come to Earth for the Last Judgment resemble Valkyries. New Jerusalem, the fated utopia for God, Jesus, and all of the faithful to live in after the apocalypse, strongly resembles Valhalla. In Revelation, the sixth of the seven seals opening causes the sun and moon to be blotted out, just like in Ragnarok when Skoll and Hati are prophesied to swallow the sun and moon. At the tail end of things, we see the throne of God surrounded by 24 elders. Could this be the Aesir and Vanir resurrected for the new age? Ouroboros, which is heavily inspired by Jormungandr, is a symbol of unending cycles. We know that after Ragnarok happens, it goes into Christianity, but then what if after Revelations it goes back into Norse mythology? It's a cycle. Hey, did you know that Adam from the Bible lived to be almost 1,000 years old? He did? Yeah, and Eve and their kids and stuff lived for ages too. Yeah, if memory serves correctly, it was a kind of punishment for eating the forbidden apple in the Garden of Eden, God's divine law of witness or something, so people knew what went down. Hang on, he lives that long after eating an apple? Or some kind of fruit? Why? Well, it's probably nothing, but in Norse mythology, the gods gained their youth, vigor, and near immortality from the apples of Idun. That she grew in her orchard, that's right. That's a funny coincidence, Eden's orchard, Garden of Eden. Yeah, I mean, it just would make a lot of sense as to why God didn't want humans eating them. Right. And come to think of it, there is this story in Norse mythology where Loki orchestrates the abduction of Eden, and all the gods grow old and weak because they don't have access to her apples anymore. Don't tell me you think the biblical god is actually Loki. No, of course not. That would mean that Loki offed all the other gods and rewrote history to pretend that he'd been the one and only god. Yeah, that would be dumb. You know how Heimdall's horn, Gjallarhorn, is said to herald Ragnarok when blown? Yeah. Well, isn't it strange how in Christianity and Revelation, each apocalyptic event is preceded by the blowing of trumpets? Well, that's religious syncretism for you. It's like how the Father, Son, Holy Spirit triad clearly borrows from the Norns. The maiden, mother, and crone, which I guess is in turn borrowed from the Fates in Greek mythology. It's all connected. It's like your theory that God is actually Baldur and that Christianity is just post-Ragnarok Norse mythology. Right, it's like the four horsemen who come to Earth as harbingers of the Last Judgment resemble Valkyries. Right, or how New Jerusalem, the fated utopia that God, Jesus, and the faithful are all supposed to live in after the apocalypse, resembles Valhalla. Right, or how the sixth of the seven seals opening causes the sun and moon to be blotted out, similar to how Skull and Hati famously eat the sun and moon during Ragnarok. Yeah, you know how Baldur is supposedly resurrected after Ragnarok as a monotheistic god? Yeah, come on man, we've discussed this ad nauseum. God is Baldur, Adam and Eve are Ash and Elm, the Garden of Eden is Eden's orchard, Loki is Lucifer, and so on and so forth. Right. But you know how Jormungandr is the main inspiration for the Ouroboros, a symbol of, unending cycles? What if Christianity isn't just post-Ragnarok Norse mythology? What if after Revelation it goes back into Norse mythology? It's a cycle. In the Bible, at the end of Revelation, the throne of God is mentioned, and it's depicted being surrounded by 24 other thrones filled with elders. What if they're just the Aesir and Vanir being resurrected for the new age? So God is secretly Loki. Yes. Because in Norse mythology, there's a story where Loki abducts the goddess Idun, who grows these apples which are responsible for the god's youth and vigor, and he supposedly gave her back, but he actually didn't, instead letting all the other gods kick the bucket and rewriting history to pretend he'd been the one and only god. But he had to keep Baldur alive because Baldur's demise is the catalyst for Ragnarok, which is still destined to happen. But what about his kids? I mean, the ones who aren't gods, at least. They wouldn't have bit the big one. What, like Fenrir, Sleipnir, Jormungandr? Yeah, what happened to them? Wait, I think you said the Leviathan that God slays is similar to Jormungandr, but why would he... Unless he wanted people to think that Jormungandr had passed away. Yeah, but why would... In Revelation, the beast from the sea draws strong similarities to Jormungandr and the other beast to Fenrir. Oh my god. What? Revelation 19 depicts a heavenly warrior battling the beast, riding on a white horse, which could be Sleipnir, eyes blazing like fire. Loki is the god of fire, with a name that no one knows but himself. Loki. It's a little Easter egg. Only he knows it's him, but why would he fight his own kids? I don't think he would. Not really. But since we've established that the myth of Ragnarok is still stuck around and he's got to find some way to spin it, what if this is his attempt to make people think Ragnarok had come to pass when it hadn't? It's theater. It's all pretend. The biblical apocalypse is just a trick for Loki to get suspicion off of himself?